I also dislike the war metaphor. My own view is that we ought to restrict the use of war to circumstances in which we are fighting proper nouns, that is, not states of mind like terror or a social problem such as drugs. The problem with the war metaphor goes further. It becomes a basis for making war against a large number of people who are, in this case, drug users. Roughly when the war against drugs started at the beginning of the 1980s, we had about 50,000 people in prisons in the United States for drug crimes that didn't involve violence. Today we have about 10 times that number in prison for drug crimes that don't involve violence, about 500,000 people. We have about 2 million arrests every year for drugs. Of those, about 800,000, or about 40%, are for crimes involving marijuana. And I'm leaving aside the trafficking of large quantities of drugs. My own view is that drug crimes that involve violence or trafficking of large quantities of drugs certainly are a proper area for law enforcement. But I have great difficulty with the idea that people should be put in prison for forms of conduct in which they do not do harm to others. If they only do harm to themselves, that doesn't necessarily mean to me that you have a basis for putting them in prison. If I eat a fat-laden steak, I'm doing harm to myself because I have a cholesterol problem. But I shouldn't go to prison because I do harm to myself by eating that steak. And I don't believe that somebody who possesses a small amount of marijuana for his own use ought to be put in prison. I should say that perhaps no place in the United States is worse in this respect than the city where I live, New York City. In New York City, between 1997 and 2006, there were some 400,000 arrests for marijuana, 10 times the number in the previous decade. And it so happens that marijuana is used roughly equally as among blacks and whites, but about 9 times as many blacks proportionately were arrested as whites for marijuana. And so it really was a kind of social control method that was used by the police. I don't believe in empowering the police to engage in that kind of social control. I think the war metaphor seems to legitimize that conduct, and I reject that conduct.
Well, we're off to a nice start. I'm not sure I know the answer to my question, but let's move on to another one. As I noted in the introduction, then Senator Obama pronounced in 2004 that the war on drugs was, quote, an utter failure. I think it's fair to say that there is in at least doing my little preparation, there is a volley of statistics that one can rely on to support or attack that assertion. Mr. Cuéllar, you indicated that perhaps there was a little bit of room on either side here about this. Are we winning this attack on drugs?
Well, I think we ought to be careful not to be drawn into pure discussion of nomenclature, but by the same token, as the previous two panelists have indicated, words do matter here. So this is why, in a way, I have to start by going back and forth a little bit with you, Justice, about the term attack. When I responded to your initial question—
Assault, repudiation, non-acceptance, which one of those synonyms
we face a national challenge. After World War II, America played a leading role around the world in helping to reconstruct Europe and Asia. That was not a war, it was not an attack, but it was a tremendous challenge. And to this very day, we see the consequences of America engaging the world that way. What I'm suggesting is, while it's extremely fraught to define things in terms of a war, perhaps, and in the many ways and situations where the president has addressed this issue, you can get a sense that, in fact, when he talks about art of failure, he's partly making some of the points that have been made here about how if you frame it purely as a war and not recognize the nuances here, it is hard to achieve victory, because there's a natural tendency to define it in such narrow terms. But by the same token, I think the real issue here, to try to respond to the point you're making now, is, are we making progress? And is it realistic for us to expect more progress? And what I can say unambiguously is, yes, we were making some progress. It is painful, it is difficult. Sometimes it means realizing that things that we thought worked well, like the DARE program, in fact, were not working. Sometimes it means, to the point that Professor Baker was making, learning from watching what is happening at the local level and simply using the bully pulpit to tell people, hey, look, in High Point, North Carolina, people got together and realized they didn't have to live with an open-air drug market in their community. They could actually tell people, you have to take responsibility or face pretty severe law enforcement consequences, which is an example of how the prevention and the enforcement actually go together sometimes. And if you don't pay attention, there are going to be consequences. And at the same time, to gradually put the right resources in front of people, and those might include things that states and localities are doing, but also things that nonprofits are doing to make sure people feel like there's an alternative to participating in that kind of black market economy. So it means all of that, but the question of whether we're going to continue to make progress, I think, is really crucially related to whether we can learn from the past. And I don't think you can look at the last 30, 40, 50 years of this and think that we haven't made some mistakes.
Are we winning the challenge against drugs?
I don't think so. I think that there is widespread drug use today. There has been widespread drug use in years past. I was interested in a document that was issued by the previous administration, which talked about the progress that had been made, and pointed to lower numbers of drug users at the end of the administration than there had been at the beginning. But then it also included some information that I thought was interesting. It said that the number of drug users was lower in all but 3 of the last 17 years. Now, if you think of that, it suggests that there is a periodic rise and fall in the amount of drug use, and we can think of many factors that influence that. We also know that there has been a very sharp increase in the number of people dying of drug overdoses. In 2002, it was something like 16,000 people in the United States who died of drug overdoses. That's a huge number. But in 2006, the last year for which I know figures, it was 26,000. That's an immense number of people. That's perhaps more people than died in automobile accidents during that year. You can't be winning the war against drugs if that many people are dying of drug overdoses. You can't be winning the war against drugs if you have such huge numbers of people in prison. You can't be winning the war against drugs if millions of people are disabled by arrest records and have difficulty getting employment or licenses because of their drug convictions. You have a number of states which deny people who have drug convictions food stamps. Gee, isn't that a smart idea? Or you have states that deny people, or there is denial of access to public housing for people who have had drug convictions. So we want them hungry on the street. We don't want them to live in public housing. And then we think we can cure the problem of drugs. That strikes me as a kind of lunacy. The idea that we're winning the war on drugs, if it is a war, and I don't like to think of it as a war, but the idea that we're winning, I just don't buy it.